And now the Environmental Protection Agency reversed its Obama-era endangerment finding last week. The finding once served as a basis for a series of policies meant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To dive in, I'm joined by EPA Deputy Administrator David Fotouhi. David Fotouhi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
Now, let's get into this so-called endangerment ruling that has been revoked by the EPA. Now, regardless of what merits or vices that it stood for, I want to first get into its impacts. How did life change for everyday Americans after this ruling was implemented back in 2009?
Well, it was one of the largest regulatory acts that EPA has ever taken in its history back in the Obama administration, when it interpreted the Clean Air Act in a novel and creative and in a way that we now think is unlawful, to grant the agency authority to issue emission standards for new cars and trucks for greenhouse gases to address climate change concerns. And as a result of that, EPA over the last 15 years had imposed over $1 trillion of costs through new regulations on manufacturers of cars and trucks, pushing them closer and closer towards building EVs, cars that the market is showing that are not popular and not meeting the needs of ordinary consumers, and increasing the price of not just those EVs, but remember, manufacturers lose money on most, if not all, of the EVs they make. Ford just last week said that they lose $27,000 per electric vehicle that they manufactured last year. That money gets made up elsewhere, and that's by increases in the price of gas-powered vehicles. So we wanted to cut through all that, and by taking the action that Administrator Zeldin did last week, we're providing that regulatory clarity and regulatory relief that the market and that everyday consumers desperately need.
Obviously, this has had a tremendous impact on manufacturers, but what was the basis for ending it scientifically and legally?
So we engaged in a year-long process that included taking public comment, 4 days of public hearings. We received about 572,000 public comments during that process. And our basic premise is simply that EPA misread its legal authority under the Clean Air Act to impose greenhouse gas emissions requirements for new cars and trucks and engines. It's simply authority that Congress did not contemplate when it passed the Clean Air Act in the 70s. It's not authority that EPA had ever used before 2009 when it made this endangerment finding under the Obama administration and then proceeded to issue regulations after that. And so based on the best interpretation of the statute, based on Supreme Court cases that have come out since 2009 that make clear that agencies have authority that's been directed to them specifically by Congress, that agencies should not read ambiguity from Congress in a statute as a grant of authority to impose additional costs and burdens on the economy. Based on all of those issues taken together, our view is that EPA lacks legal authority to carry out the endangerment finding. And then we also said one very important thing, which is, practically speaking, even if you use the modeling, the climate modeling that the last administration relied on, that we have some serious concerns with, but even if you take it at face value, if we were to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from all cars and trucks in the US, and again, we don't have authority to do that, but just the modeling shows that in 2050, the difference in global average temperatures would be 1/100th of a degree. That is an infinitesimal number, and more importantly, it's smaller than the variability in the model itself. It's below the margin of error, so to speak. So we found that it would simply be outside of our legal authority to impose the type of costs, $1.3 trillion, that these rules impose on the economy with this, with the legal authority that we have.
Well, now we take a look at its impacts that it's had for the 10 plus years that since it's been implemented. How long is it until we see some real changes from the new policies, and what might that look like for Americans and U.S. manufacturers?
Well, we've been very clear from day one that revitalizing the domestic automobile manufacturing sector is a key priority for the administration overall and for Administrator Zeldin at EPA. So manufacturers now understand, and they now have the clarity to know that EPA is not going to be imposing costly emissions obligations for greenhouse gases on vehicles moving forward, including model years that are under development right now. And so they will know that they do not need to invest in spending and rather invest in costly technology and features like the stop start button that is the bane of many folks driving, where when they get to a red light, their car automatically shuts off and then turns back on when they lift the brake pedal. So you'll start to see manufacturers being able to invest in building cars that consumers actually want to buy, and not invest in building cars that sit on the lot and end up losing money for those manufacturers, end up costing jobs and increasing the price of new cars.
Who benefits the most with these regulations lifted, other than car manufacturers?
Well, by far, it's the consumer. This is going to reduce the price of cars by about $2,400 per vehicle, and that's an average. And again, it's not just reducing the price of EVs, it's reducing the price of all vehicles because of the tremendous amounts of investment over the last few years that manufacturers were devoting to EVs that simply consumers did not want to buy. So consumers will start to see those costs passed along from not having to comply with these burdensome, overly prescriptive, and unnecessary regulations. And if I could just make one last point, which is EPA is still regulating traditional pollutants that come out of the tailpipe. This is not a situation where we are abdicating our responsibility to protect human health and the environment. Emissions of nitrogen oxides and soot and those other types of pollutants that come out of the tailpipe that we've been regulating for 50 years and even longer, that remains unchanged regardless of this action. This is a direct response to the Obama administration twisting our authority under the Clean Air Act to address so-called global climate change concerns in a way that the Clean Air Act was never designed to do.
And has the EPA faced any legal pushback from climate activists since this regulation was repealed last week?
Well, we fully expect to have to litigate and defend our decision in court. The various left-wing climate organizations and other groups, Democrat-led states, have made clear that they would rather cars cost more, that they want to continue having EPA require manufacturers to impose additional technologies and tools and costly features on vehicles that don't actually serve much, if any, purpose. And so they're going to be fighting that in court.
And the last question here, I just want to ask more on the local level. How much can the EPA impact states like California, which have policies that release rainwater into the ocean to protect the endangered Delta smeltfish, but like those same policies are also not helping during periods of drought and wildfires? What can the EPA do to assist California and other states that may push back against some of the federal government's regulations?
Yeah, we're very attuned to the issues happening in California. The administrator from day one made it a priority to help Southern Californians recover from the devastating wildfires in the LA area. He was on the ground just a couple of weeks ago to make sure that the permitting process was moving swiftly and that folks were able to rebuild their lives. Look, states have a role in our environmental regulatory system. Many of the statutes that Congress has passed envision a role for states, but states have to act within the law. States have to act based on the facts on the ground and common sense. And so we've taken actions this year where we've rejected some steps that California has taken. For example, California wanted to launch a program under the Clean Air Act where they imposed their emissions inspection requirements on vehicles, trucks, for example, from out of state. That is not consistent with the law, and so we rejected that. Last summer, Congress rejected through a Congressional Review Act resolution the waivers that California had previously sought to set its own greenhouse gas emission standards for motor vehicles. So this administration, hand in hand with Congress, has been very clear that states have a role in this process, but states cannot exceed their authority under the law, and that states need to act with common sense in a way that prioritizes their citizens over some of the special interests.
Well, David Fotouhi, EPA Deputy Administrator, thank you so much for your insights here today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be on. Thank you.